much to everybody who purchased a party box. We really appreciate your support of the community, and just, gosh, we saw all kinds of fabulous pictures of oysters and cocktails. There was even a dog with a party hat. So, I mean, just thank you for sharing all of the festivities from your homes yesterday. And I just encourage you to continue to do that this evening. And also, the farmers, everybody has different oyster varieties in their boxes. We would just love it if you would tag them as well. So just thank you so much for sharing all of that enthusiasm with everybody. We had oysters in there. We had all kinds of goodies. We're going to talk about a few of them. And just, we want you to know that supporting the farmers is super important, but it's really helping the hospitality industry, the other folks involved, the chefs, just students, so many people that are involved in the growing and the enthusiasm and carrying the positive message of sustainable oyster farming. So just thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And with that appreciation, I think what I'd like to do is just give a shout out. Everybody in their boxes got a bunch of papers. So the first thing was a thank you to our generous sponsors. I'm just going to go ahead and read them. First and foremost, Evans Meats and Seafood up in Birmingham. Y'all rock. We just could not have done this without your help. So thank you. Kimball House, without them there would be no Oysters South, the entire crew there. Scout Branding, thank you for the wonderful logo and all the time and getting the recipe cards set up. Y'all get a bunch of amazing cocktail and food recipes as well. So thank you to Scout Branding for that. Tip Top Proper Cocktails, Savannah Distributing, our Murphy Knives, Allagash Brewing, and also RAP Technologies. So everybody who contributed as a sponsor, thank you so very much. We really appreciate it. Yes.
Take a pause here.
I'm going to take a quick pause.
And see if people can hear you now. Go ahead.
We're trying without a microphone.
We are trying without a microphone because I guess, my voice, right? I may be short-circuiting the microphone. So let's see if that
So let's ask Mr. Brian Sells if he can hear voice better now.
Can you hear me now, people? Because I'm going to keep talking. So hopefully that has helped the audio, because we've got a lot to cover, not just the stuff in the box, but like I said, we are going to talk about, the oyster cages and the baskets and just the process of growing oysters themselves, and just what makes each of some of the varieties unique, how they're the same and how they're different. So hopefully, we can just, we can learn to appreciate oysters even more than we all already do. I know everybody's a huge fan, but there's always, I feel like you could always learn something new about how to shuck them, how to prepare them if you want to cook them, and what kinds of oyster accompaniments there are. Certainly, there's some of the classic ones we'll talk about, but there's also some others. So I think what I'd like to do is just go through.
Before you do that, we'll just let folks know that we're also recording this as a different video that we can upload later. So
yes, thank you, Dr.
Maybe we can
Watson.
put that in the text.
Yes, we can also, this will also be available to folks on our web, not the web page. We could probably do that, but on our Facebook page on Oyster South, this broadcast will be available later. So if we don't get to answer your questions as you submit them, we can do that later. We're going to try to anticipate some frequently asked questions in our talks. So that way the majority of folks will have those answered. But certainly we encourage you to ask us any and all questions. So with that, just real quick, Snazzy Tip Top Proper Cocktails, thank you very much for sponsoring this amazing cocktail glass that's co-branded along with the Oyster South logo, and Savannah Distributing, thank you so much for that as well. Y'all have a couple in your recipe stack. There's there's 3 cocktail recipes, one from Miles McCory up at Kimball House, and the other from Kelly Thorne with Hugh Atchison Restaurants. So certainly encourage y'all to try your versions of those at home. Certainly, those folks are very busy, and we just appreciate you, both Kelly and Miles, for sharing those. So next down the line, what we're going to talk about is our Shucking Towel. So certainly safety first, people. When you're shucking your oysters, I mean, everybody has a different technique, a different knife, a different style, but certainly get a glove, get a shucking knife, get a towel, get something to protect your hands for sure. The other things in your box, I took them out of the ice. Make sure y'all keep them refrigerated. But we did have some questions on social media last night, but I want to just clarify that. We've got these 2 oyster accompaniments. We've got a mignonette from Chef Bill Brand at Fisher's in Orange Beach. Thanks, Chef Bill. It's awesome. We appreciate you. And then from Chef Brian Wolf up at Kimball House, this is jalapeno hot sauce. And trust me, it is hot. That's why these are in these little droppers. So make sure you use them sparingly, but they're super delicious. So thank you, chefs. We also have from Julia Sullivan of the Party Line and Henrietta Red up in Nashville, this amazing green curry butter. And so if y'all just feel creative and want to try and grill some oysters up, definitely include this as part of your recipe. But I think Chef Julia put enough, so that way if you want to try it on something else, you can do that as well. I can't guarantee that there will not be a cameo by a butterfly or birds, because we are out in nature here, just looking off in the distance here on Dauphin Island. Originally we were going to broadcast from the research farm, but because of the wind direction, we were concerned about sound quality and different things, so you just kind of got to go with it. Mother Nature. That's the nature of oyster farming right there. Let's see. So, shucking knives, y'all had 2. One was branded from Toadfish with the Allagash Brewing Company. Thank you for including that, y'all. And R. Murphy knives with the Oyster South logo. So you can try out each of these. And if you need a refresher course, there is the How to Shuck an Oyster card from R. Murphy as well. So please refer to that if you do need some pointers. And the other thing that was in your box, the paper items, you had the sponsors, all of these amazing recipes from chefs. We had a thank you note in there to everybody. And I just want to wrap up with, you also had this waterproof Oyster Compass that is courtesy of the National Sea Grant Program and the Auburn University Shellfish Lab. And I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Bill Walton to talk about and guide y'all through the Oyster Compass and some of the varieties of oysters.
I'm Bill Walton. I'm with the Auburn University Shellfish Lab. We're trying to continue the Facebook Live from Oyster South. Had sort of the party box from their Landlocked 4 Deconstructed here. What I wanted to talk to you today about was, you got a variety of oysters. In fact, I don't know which 3 varieties you got, but everybody got 3 varieties, including Beth and I got a box, and we got 3 varieties, and we didn't know what we were going to get when we got them. So when you open up your box and you look inside this, and you've got these different oysters with different names, or they look a little different, the color of the bag is different, the tag is different, but what does that mean? How do you start to tell apart an oyster? And so we did develop this Oyster Compass. This is something the Shellfish Lab, big shout out to Becky Wasden, who's a co-author of this. She was at the lab, and she helped us put together this Oyster Compass with National Sea Grant. The idea for this is for seafood servers. So the person that you're asking when you're at a restaurant, well, tell me a little bit about these oysters. This was sort of a cheat sheet for folks to think about, how are these oysters different? Why are these oysters different? As part of the party box, though, we thought this would be a nice thing for folks that care enough to get 3 varieties of oysters shipped to them, that you might care enough to think about how you consider each oyster. So we tried to do this in a way that's fairly easy to remember, and we used the compass points of and we start in the south. And the first one is species. So let me start out with this. You didn't get one of these in your box, but I happen to, Beth and I we're kind of oyster people. And so we happen to have in our refrigerator some West Coast oysters. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing is what species of oysters you get. Everybody in their box got what we call the Eastern oyster, the Virginia oyster. The fancy name is Chrysostrea virginica. All right, but there are other species of oysters. Some of you have probably heard of the Pacific oyster. So this is out of Washington State. It's a sister species to our Eastern oyster. All right, it has a very different flavor, but it is related. There are also, some of you may have heard of Balans, some of you may have heard of Olympias. So there's just all different varieties of oysters that, that you can get. So the first thing that you want to know if you're an oyster eater is what species do you have? In your boxes for this party, you all have the same species. So we're all starting with the same species. What's amazing to me about that is that species is the same species that's grown from the Canadian Maritime provinces down to the Gulf of Mexico. And if you think about how different those are, that's really incredible. How do they get different? One of the big things is the environment. So you need to think about how they're grown. So in our party box, and this is literally, this is what we were sent. So this is what came in our box. All right. I'm going to start with the Skipper Sweets, Skipper Sweets out of the Panhandle of Florida. That's these two oysters. All right. And then, and I've arranged these in order of increasing salinity, because a lot of people who like to eat oysters find that if you eat your saltiest oysters first, you don't tend to savor the flavors of the sweeter oysters as much. So we had Skipper Sweets out of the Panhandle of Florida from Serenoa. That's John Harley growing those. Then I've got Mon Louis grown by John Webster here in Grand Bay, Alabama. I think it's funny that those oysters came back, which is awesome. And then we had the Fat Bellies out of Crystal Coast in North Carolina. So let's think about this. Again, they're all the same species. But what's the environment that, for example, the Skipper Sweets were grown in? Well, they're grown in Skipper Bay, and their salinity, full ocean, is 32 to 35 parts per thousand. Their salinity is typically that 20 to 30. 20 is still enough salt that you can definitely taste salt, but it is not the salty oyster that somebody from Cape Cod might be expecting. But it does let you taste a lot of those other flavors of this sweetness. So they've got a couple freshwater inputs. They've got, I think it's Skipper Creek and Purify Creek that feed in some fresh water along with the minerals and the nutrients that come with that fresh water. And that helps give those a distinctive flavor. What's the next part? I'll get to the other oysters in a minute, but you had species, you have the environment, and then you go to the north, and that's nurture. How are they grown? The Skipper Sweets are grown in a longline basket. So this is where they're sort of suspended, and Andrea's going to show you, Adrian is going to show you some of these in a bit, but those baskets are suspended in the water and they rock with the waves, and it lets the oysters sort of feed in the top part of the water where there's a lot of food and a lot of wave action. These guys do shake their baskets. They try to break the edges of the oyster off to get a nice deep cup on their oyster. And John swears that he talks to his oysters because he swears that it makes a difference. And that brings us to the last part of the compass, is the who and the why. You could have people that are growing oysters in the same environment with the same methods, but you have different reasons that they might do it. John, I think, also does some work with some consulting companies with wetlands delineation, because his company's actually Serenoa, which is named after the scientific name for saw palm. And he and his family grow oysters. This is something that they're trying to add to what they do in the Panhandle of Florida. I think they live in Sopchoppy. All right, so let's use that for these Mon Louis. So again, same species. The environment that they're grown is Grand Bay, and that also can be anywhere from 15 to 25, 26 parts per thousand. Right now, the environment in Grand Bay is very salty. We have not had a lot of rain, and so these oysters are saltier than the Skipper Sweets right now. That can vary. That's something that you might want to ask your server if you're out at a restaurant, is how salty are the oysters. That's something that they should know. Grand Bay is surrounded by woods. There's no houses around it. It's remote. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's one of the most biologically productive areas that I've ever worked. It's full of fish and crabs. It's great. John grows his oysters in floating cages up at the surface, and they have to flip those cages periodically to get the oysters dry so the oysters stay nice and clean. So you can see how clean these oysters are, but also, again, nicely shaped oyster that has given a really nice cup to it. John is actually a medical doctor. He is, but someone who had an agricultural background. And honestly, John is somebody they've done different types of farming. He got the oyster farming bug, and I think it's something that John really just wants to make the environment a better place. I think he likes farming, but one of the main reasons he does this is he feels that oyster farming makes our coastal waters a little bit better. All right, let's use that compass again on this last oyster. So these are the Fat Bellies from Crystal Coast, North Carolina, and these are going to be our saltiest oysters. Again, these are all the same species, but this one is grown in probably the saltiest water. It's probably like 31, 32 parts per thousand. and they're grown between Morehead City and, well, near Morehead City on the river, I'm blanking on the river name, but they're grown in that river's waters. But they get lots of ocean water coming in, giving them that super briny flavor with some of those ocean flavors. What is there? That's their environment. Their methods are they take these oysters and they're actually growing these oysters intertidally. I'll explain what that means, but they're growing these on a sandbar. They're putting these in cages that sit on the bottom and letting the tide go in and out every day over these oysters. That's what intertidal means. It means they live in the middle of the tides. So every day they're getting some wave action, and then they're getting some sun to dry them out, and then the tide comes back in and they're getting another drink. And you can see that it gives you an oyster that is very happy, grows a nice fat belly, and has a nice strong shell. There's a lot of, I think, if I remember from Crystal Coast, they tumble their oysters every 4 to 6 weeks in the middle of the growing season. So they're taking a lot of care to try to produce a really nice, beautiful oyster with a nice fat meat to it. So, and that is Beth, that's John and Kyle and Phil. Kyle and Phil are the two guys running Crystal Coast and working on these sites. They've got a couple other varieties of oysters that they grow. So I'm just going to get that a little bit closer so you can take a look at those variations. Again, anybody that's had eastern oysters, you know, you can have stuff from Prince Edward Island down to Louisiana, and those are almost always the exact same species of oysters, and they're going to take on the flavor of where they're grown. So I think that is what I wanted to cover. Again, this compass is just a way for you to think about, okay, what species do they have on the menu? What environment were they grown in? How were they grown? And the who and the why. I'm going to jump back to the nurture part because I skipped over a whole lot of important stuff with that, and I'm going to hand that to Dr. Adrian Michaelis, who works with us here at the Shellfish Lab, to explain a little bit about how we grow oysters.
But again, thank you all for joining. So Bill talked about some of the nurture, and a lot of people out there outside of the Oyster South community even may not understand what we're talking about when we say farmed oysters compared to wild. So I want to talk about what's involved in that nurture to get oysters from babies to these beautiful market-sized oysters that you find on your dinner plate. And so first I have over here some seed. And so just like a land crop, farmers typically get their oysters as seed, so very small oysters. And I have here some that were spawned over at the Auburn Shellfish Lab, and I'll come closer. So these were spawned just last month, and you can see they are pretty tiny, different sizes. So these are little baby oysters that oyster farmers might buy at this size. They might even buy a little smaller. They might even buy a little larger. But so then it's their job to take these tiny oysters and help them make it to adult size. And so we have commercial hatcheries throughout the South that they are buying seed from. Some places, some farmers might also be using a wild set. So some of the wild oysters that grow on their gear that they may use and put into baskets like these. So Bill talked about the hanging baskets. But so they'll be tending to these oysters to help them grow from those tiny seed all the way out to market size oysters. And in doing so, they'll be helping to make sure that things aren't growing on them that could prevent them from feeding, that the gear like these baskets aren't getting fouled. And so with this type of gear, so this is what you might see, especially in the Gulf Coast, so in areas where they can't really put oysters on bottom, they'll have gear that will rock with the waves, and so it's helping to tumble these oysters and shake them and help keep them clean and do some of the work. And so we have these oysters, which came out of Grand Bay. We have a high school training program farm that these were grown on. And so these guys were spawned at the end of April and have been growing out on the farm since then. And so you can see they're not quite ready to eat. You could eat them, but we're hoping for something bigger. So we expect that these will continue growing until maybe around Mardi Gras season. We might have oysters that are ready to sell. And we have other types of gear, and see if I can drag this over here. So you might also see floating gear where oysters are kept in bags like this that go in floating cages. And so these would be at the surface, or they might have floats on the side, where it would be the same thing where the waves could rock the oysters in the bag, water's flowing through, and the gear is designed so that you could flip and try to dry them out. So you're drying them out at the surface to again help make sure that your oysters are feeding easily, water's flowing through, and and everything is moving as it should.
I have a question, which I'm guessing people might be wondering.
Okay.
Dr. Michaelis, what is it that oysters eat?
What is it that oysters eat? So they are filter feeders. So they're filtering tiny bits of plankton that come through. So algae, and that's why oysters are great at helping improve water clarity, because they're filtering nutrients like algae. And so you'll see in restoration projects, people may be using oysters to help improve clarity and help with sort of high nitrogen. But where farmed oysters are grown, they are all places that are healthy waters to eat oysters from. And so while you can use aquaculture oysters for restoration, these ones are being grown strictly to eat. And so once they get to market size, then they'll leave the water. But in the meantime, they're still doing these things. So they're filtering water, they're providing benefits just like a wild oyster will do. And some people may get confused when they hear farmed, but these are in the same water that you would find wild oysters in. They are right out here, technically right over here, off of the Gulf in Grand Bay. They are all along the southeast, up the northeast, west coast, Chesapeake Bay. So they're sitting in the water, they're filtering water in natural environments. And at the same time, so they're providing these sorts of benefits, they're also providing jobs, and they're helping to provide a cultural component and help maintain working waterfront communities and seafood communities.
So I'll jump in with a question that we sometimes get when we do this is about keeping oysters cold, why that's important. This relates to the R rule, if anybody's heard of the R rule, and you're only supposed to eat oysters in months with an R. Why is that? Well, the tradition for that, I'm hoping that your mic, no, I'm hoping your mic will pick this up. The tradition for that probably comes out of a couple things. One is quality, that the oyster in the summer is really good at spawning, and that changes the flavor. A spawning oyster tastes different than a fat winter oyster. And the most disappointing thing is an oyster that has spawned out. And anybody that's gotten an oyster in the middle of the summer at a restaurant, where when you opened up the oyster, you didn't get something like this, where you've got this beautiful plump meat in it, but it actually almost looks like a translucent bag. And I don't know what in Maryland, what do they call those? I mean, we call them water bellies. I don't know if there's a different name up in
Spawned out
Chesapeake.
oysters.
Yeah, I don't know if there's
All
a
right.
special name for it.
Well, we call them water bellies, and they're disappointing because it's basically a bag of salt water. There's no other flavor to it, really, because most of that oyster is now out in the ocean. So one, you might want to avoid it for that. The other reason you might avoid months without an R is just the risk. There's always a risk of eating raw oysters because they are out in the environment. So they're taking in everything in the environment. We have such a good public health system that makes sure that they're not taking in dangerous things from people. All right, like whether that's viruses or whatever. We've got a good system in place for that. But there are naturally occurring bacteria that are not associated with sewage at all. Nothing to do with that. They're just in the water. And these oysters do take a little mouthful of that. And that's why if you're immune compromised, you shouldn't be eating raw oysters. But that risk, because we know that some people who are immune compromised still do, that risk goes up in the summer because there's just more of those in the water. So why would you eat farmed oysters or any oyster in the months without an R? Farmers have two things that they can do. One, they can grow something that's essentially a seedless oyster that doesn't spawn. So like seedless watermelons, it will not spawn out in the summer, so you never get that water belly in the summer. So you sort of solve that quality issue with that. And then the second thing is safety. These farmers all have their names on these oysters. And so the first step is that they have to get their oysters cold in a really short amount of time. Here in Alabama, I think it's 1 hour. From the time they harvest the oyster, it has to be in refrigeration within 1 hour and getting cold. And there are rules about how fast it has to get cold from there. That's how you stop it. We sort of describe it as like a glass of milk. Like, a glass of milk is okay unless you let it sit out in the sun for too long. And that's how we sort of treat our oysters. And so I'm okay with that because they were on a metal tray that was still cold, so I'm okay with them having sat out. But for anybody that eats oysters, you want to keep your oysters cold. You don't want to just get them cold initially, you want to keep them cold. And so I always love my oysters being served cold. So that's one of the questions we get. I think one of the other questions that we've been asked, so how does this help coastal communities? I mean, so people are farming oysters, but so what? Like we've sort of talked about how that might help communities. How can this help coastal communities?
So in a physical sense, farming oysters is helping coastal communities because gear like this, similar to a wild oyster reef, is helping to prevent wave action. So when we have big storms and hurricanes coming in, it can help slow down some of that waves that are associated with storms. But on a social side of things, on the cultural side, in many of the places where we're seeing oyster farming already existing and starting along the coast, it's areas that are traditional seafood communities. So these are communities that their character is associated with and founded in iconic seafood that they've harvested out of those waters. And for one reason or another, some of these different fisheries may not be doing as well, and oyster farming presents an alternate means of income and a way to continue these sort of waterfront traditions where the community is still harvesting seafood, just in a slightly different way.
I think one of the things we found is that it is a different way of making a living, but it is still a way to make a living on the water. And so if you're going to keep these communities together, there have to be ways to make a living that require that you be there on the water. So I think that's to me one of the biggest reasons that we do this. Is it was just amazing to start driving around here in Alabama and start seeing boats go down the road full of oyster gear and knowing that people are doing that and making a living. That was just really cool. Do you have any questions that came in, or has our...
No, people are just intently listening. One of the things that we often get asked is about is it the same species? I mean, because our members go from North Carolina, south to Florida, and west to Texas.
Right.
So is it the same oyster?
Want to handle it?
Yeah, so for the Oyster South region, yes, it is the same oyster. It's the species Chrysostrea virginica, which you can find all along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast and even down into the coast of South America on the Atlantic side. But when you're getting oysters from the Northwest, for example, you might get another species. So they actually grow multiple species in the Northwest. And up in New England, the eastern oyster, the Chrysostrea virginica, is still the dominant, but there are occasionally some growers there that are growing a second species as well.
And just to emphasize that those species may all be oysters, but the species can taste very, very different. So you can serve like a Pacific oyster and an East Coast oyster or a Gulf Coast oyster, and the flavor that comes out of that is partly affected by just what species you're eating. I think many people think of the Pacifics as having like a stronger flavor and almost like a melony finish type thing, and whereas the Eastern oyster is tended thought of as a milder oyster that tends to take on more the flavor of its environment a little bit more. But yeah, those are that's a very big difference in them, but typically we are growing the same species across the
So it sounds to me like one of the things is obviously the farmer. I mean, it's the same species, and we've definitely had questions about people asking, well, what are all the factors that go in? I mean, you talked about most of them. Is it similar to the way people grow wine or microbrews? I mean, would you draw that same analogy?
Just occurred to me, they may not be able to hear Beth. So the question there was, is this sort of an analogy to microbrews or wines? And I think 100% that we've had some farmers tell us, and I think this is true. I can open up a box of oysters and I can tell how much attention was paid to those oysters, like just by looking at it. Like it depends on the shape and maybe how much fouling. That's the fouling is the critters that live on the outside of the shell. So to give you an example of fouling, this Pacific has all sorts of barnacles on it. So this is the oyster, these are a bunch of barnacles. And that doesn't hurt the oyster, it doesn't hurt the flavor of the oyster, it's just a different look. And some people want a really clean oyster, some people don't mind the fouling on it. And so, absolutely, certainly the species and the environment that you're growing in make a huge difference, but the farmer then has the ability to sort of craft those things given those constraints, I think. And to me, that's very much like a microbrew. I've talked to some folks who grow hops in Michigan, actually, which is your home state, and they talk about hops the way we talk about oysters.
Yeah. Want to thank everybody for tuning in and for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. Just appreciate y'all's patience. And thank you again to everybody who did purchase a party box. Keep partying all weekend. Keep posting those pictures and sharing them and tagging them on social media. And you know, tell your friends too. I mean, this is a great opportunity. I mean, we just did provided some great information to y'all, but you know, you, the educated consumer, really play an important role too. I'm sure people have some of the same questions that you heard answered today, but please feel free to refer them to our website, oystersouth.com, or to our social media. And certainly if you didn't get a party box, you can also help support Oyster South by making a donation, or you can purchase merchandise. And certainly any of the farms that we talked about, or any of them listed on our site, please do reach out to them directly and, you know, see kind of what their procedure is for shipping, because they certainly appreciate the support. I just want to give a quick wrap-up shout out again to our sponsors. Just appreciate it so much, everybody who stepped up. And for the other recipes, all the chefs who took the time, I just want to, you know, mention Chef Julia again, Steven Satterfield in Atlanta, Miller Union. We talked about Kelly and Miles for the cocktails. Thank you all. Rob McDaniel, Frank Stitt, thank you chefs for the amazing grilled oyster recipe. Chris Hathcock at Husk in Savannah, thank you so much. Thank you all for contributing to the party box, the first ever one. We hope to continue the party remotely, and certainly next year, we really hope everything, you know, we're able to, you know, just get together in person, because we really do miss seeing everybody's faces and getting together. So certainly, y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you all so much.